after the webinar may be displayed on websites or public forums in future, just so that you're aware of that. My name is Brenda Garrard-Forster. I'm General Manager of HR Anywhere at AB Phillips, and really excited to present you with this webinar this afternoon. We know that vaccinations are becoming increasingly critical to us returning to everyday life, and it's obviously putting a huge amount of pressure on business owners with legislative obligations to workplace health and safety. You also have obligations under the Privacy Act as well as Fair Work. And we've been inundated with clients asking us questions relating to things like the wearing of masks, mandating vaccinations, vulnerable co-workers with underlying medical conditions, what do they do in the case of standing employees down, right through to terminating employment. So hence the reason for today's webinar, and we thought it was really important to partner with Moray and Agnew and have Nick Duggal, who is their National Workplace Practice Group Head, present some really interesting information to you today. But just for those of you who aren't aware of HR Anywhere, or you may know us as People with Solutions, so we've been going through a rebranding exercise over the past couple of months, and we will officially relaunch the HR Anywhere brand in the coming weeks. We provide HR consulting services, so anything to do with the full portfolio really of HR. So that could be from preparing contracts to writing policies and procedures, representing you at Fair Work for an unfair dismissal case, so representing you for conciliations. We also have what we call a People Matters advice line, which is a subscription advice line for our clients where you can call or a Teams meeting or even an email where you require basic advice as and when it's required throughout the year. We also provide services in the work cover space as well, so helping you with work cover insurance or managing any work cover claims, right through to workplace health and safety, policies and procedures, and safety management processes. We're also going to just run a quick poll for those that are on the line. So if you wouldn't mind answering 5 questions that are now going to sort of pop up on the screen for you. We'll just give you a little bit of time to answer those questions, and then we'll reconvene. And while you're completing that poll, we know obviously that this is a really hot topic at the moment. So if you have a question or a comment that you'd like to make throughout the webinar, we really encourage you to either type a question or please feel free to hit the chat button and you can ask us a question directly. We really would like to make this webinar as interactive as possible. Okay, I think we might be ready to go, Nick.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that introduction, Brenda, and good afternoon and welcome everyone. Great to be with you today, and it's great to be with AB Phillips and HR Anywhere and their network in relation to this really important topic at the moment. Cooler, if we could please get the next slide. So we're we're going to be talking today about vaccinations and the role of employers and what their obligations are. And if I could just make an introductory comment about that, there's been a lot of press and debate and discussion around this topic about whether employers can mandate their employees to be vaccinated. And it's been presented almost as this kind of binary choice. Either you make that mandate or you don't. But the reality is that there's a number of other considerations and an order with which employers should be considering this question that extends beyond whether or not a mandatory vaccination position is warranted. The starting position that I would encourage employers to consider and recognise is that they have a broad duty to provide a safe place of work. Now, the reality has become, in particular in metropolitan Victoria and New South Wales, that relevant to discharging that health and safety responsibility is having regard to the risk of transmission of the virus. That's now reality. Now, in terms of managing that risk, vaccinations are relevant now, you could say, to discharging that duty, whether that means mandating it, whether that means making inquiries about it, whether that means in relation to your workers or other visitors. They are a myriad of other considerations that need to be worked through. Now, the end point in relation to that might be mandatory vaccinations, or for some work sites it might not be. But it's really important to go through that journey from an occupational health and safety perspective, and that's what we're going to be doing today. And as Brenda said, we certainly welcome your inquiries. As you will see, and as what my introductory comments suggest, is that it really comes down to the specifics of the worksite. So if you've got questions in relation to your type of worksite or type of industry, please do let us know. Also, we're not reserving questions to the end. We're happy to take questions through. So as I touch upon something that spurs a question, please feel free to use the chat or other function to ask that question as it arises. Thank you. And cool, if I could get the next slide. So if I could just begin with a bit of an overview of the topics that we're going to take today. We are going to start with the position in relation to vaccinations in the workplace and what the general considerations or starting position on that is. We're then going to look specifically at lawful and reasonable directions and when an employer is potentially entitled to make a direction around vaccinations, including being vaccinated. Then we're going to look a little bit more closely in how you should assess the risk in relation to the virus and therefore the need for vaccination at your particular work site. And we're then going to look at that risk in relation to broader community considerations and other factual developments that continue to arise in relation to the level of transmission and the like. From there, I'd like to then take you through what I think is a bit of an employer action plan, some steps that you can, as an employer, ought to begin to be taking now, and any final considerations. And then there will be another more focused opportunity for question and answer at the end of that. So that's just a bit of a summary. And if we can go now to the next slide. Now, one of the things that I'm going to be speaking about quite a bit in this webinar and referencing is the Fair Work Ombudsman guidance note in relation to vaccinations in the workplace. So for those of you who don't know, the Fair Work Ombudsman is the governing regulatory body in relation to workplaces. And it, in the last few weeks, released a guidance note in relation to how employers should be approaching the issue of vaccination in the worksite. So the guidance note, as the name suggests, it's guidance. It's not a prescriptive direction. If you take a look at the guidance note, you'll see it's couched in terms which are not entirely definitive. You know, terms like it's likely that this lawful direction will be reasonable and things like that. So it doesn't have the status of law. And one of the reasons why we're in this position where we're somewhat reliant on a guidance note is we don't have a body of law in relation to the need to vaccinate in the context of COVID. We've got some decisions about vaccination in the workplace, for example, decisions on the flu and things like that, but they're not contextually that relevant to the position that we all find ourselves now in the pandemic. And this is not the first time. Yes.
Hi, Nick. We've just got a question. One of our attendees has asked, are we allowed to keep a copy of proof of vaccination of employees and subcontractors? And they've been told that it's illegal as it's a medical record.
It's a good question, and we'll be going into that in more detail. What I would look at it a different way, and this is what the Information Commission has published as well. What you need to establish is whether there is a need, and you're right, it is a medical record, but if you can substantiate that there is a need to keep a medical record, then you are entitled to keep it. Now, there's rules around how you need to maintain possession of that document, but if, for example, there's a basis to ask someone for proof of vaccination, then the argument would, in my view, follow that you're entitled to retain that form of medical record. Because if it's established that there's an occupational health and safety need to check whether someone's vaccinated, how can you catalogue that if you can't hold on to the record? So if the question is it illegal to hold a medical record? No, but any holding of a medical record must be in accordance with the Health Records Act, and it must be on the basis of a genuine need. Thank you. And as I say, we'll be going into the holding of records and the like in a little bit more detail. So I was speaking of the Fair Work Ombudsman guidance note, which is kind of the best that we have. So that's going to be, that really is, I think, kind of the centerpiece for how you ought to approach the issue of vaccinations. As you can see, not every employer is slavishly following it, but if what you do is in accordance with the guidance note, I think you're well positioned to be able to justify the approach that you've taken. And what the guidance note spells out, so if we can just stick to that slide for another moment, is that there's essentially 3 circumstances in which an employer may require an employee to be vaccinated and to provide proof. And also, I think this would apply to other things around vaccination. For example, asking an employee whether they are to provide evidence as to whether they are vaccinated or not. Now, the first of those is where there is a public health order. So, for example, the position in New South Wales is that it has made health orders mandating vaccinations in certain settings, including in schools. So if your type of worksite is subject to a public health order requiring all employees at those particular sites to be vaccinated, then you are required to follow it. Now, I will say, and as a member of the audience pointed out from the outset, these health orders are under legal challenge. But for the time being, until any such legal challenge has been upheld, and it wouldn't be the first legal challenge to health orders that has been made over the course of the pandemic. Until any challenge is upheld, that continues to be the position, that employers are required to comply with health orders. So in relation to those health orders I just mentioned in New South Wales, there's no mirror health order in Victoria at the moment, but the situation in relation to what health orders we might get remains fluid. For example, we've seen movement in the area of schools where there's been the expediting of vaccinations for Year 12 students. And we've also seen foreshadowed that for construction work to return at certain percentages, that the workforce needs to be over a certain percentage of vaccination. So we may well see more health orders strictly mandating vaccination at some sites. But I would also make the point that where there is a health order, for example, requiring a certain percentage of vaccination in order for more workers to be able to be on site, that can also influence whether an employer directs its employees to be vaccinated, or also asks for health information in relation to whether they're vaccinated or not. So that's the first thing to have a look at. Is, are there any health orders relevant to workers that you want to regularise their vaccination status? And it's important to keep abreast of that, because it's constantly changing. And certainly in Victoria, I think we're going to be seeing some more changes. Now, the second thing to then look at is there an agreement or employment contract that includes provisions around vaccination? Now, for some settings, it's possible that enterprise agreements or contracts deal specifically with vaccination, but if those industrial instruments or contracts predate the pandemic, it's probably pretty unlikely. But I do, however, make the point that when you are employing new people or even renegotiating or re-entering into an enterprise bargaining agreement, it's open to you now to include specific terms around the need to be vaccinated. So I think that's certainly something to consider in relation to new workers you're taking on, and whether you make it a term and condition of their engagement that they either disclose or agree to be vaccinated. Now, the third area in which the Fair Work Ombudsman says that it's possible to direct an employer to be vaccinated or get other information about vaccination is where it's a lawful and reasonable direction. So even if there is not a public health order, and even if it's not a term and condition of the employment, there can still be scope for employers to be directed to be vaccinated if it's lawful and reasonable in the circumstances. So let's have a little bit more of a look about that.
Hi, Nick. Just before we move on, we've actually
Sure.
got a question, and I know that I've had a client actually ask me this question as well. What prohibits an employer in requiring employees to complete an anonymous survey to understand the vaccination adoption level? So not actually understanding who's been vaccinated, but how, I guess, the percentage of their workforce have been vaccinated.
I would think that a request or the circulation of a survey, which is anonymous, asking information in relation to employees' vaccination status would be pretty reasonable. Now, there might be elements of that survey that might make its reasonableness variable. For example, if it was compulsory to complete the survey, if the anonymity of the survey was called into question, for example, if it was a very small worksite, or if it, and we'll go into this, is a tier 4 worksite, for example, a worksite where everyone can work from home. But I would have thought that an anonymous survey would be pretty easy to justify to begin to get a sense of what proportion of your worksite is vaccinated. Now, for certain settings where there's higher risks around the virus and being vaccinated, would an anonymous survey be sufficient? Potentially not. Employers might need to go even further than that. But I think it's a pretty reasonable starting position. So we'll have a talk about those sorts of measures.
Okay, that's great. And just quickly, one other question, if you don't mind, Nick.
Sure.
What if an employment agreement or contract has provisions around medical examinations when required? And we know that's quite a typical clause that is in an employment contract. And the attendee is asking, can this be interpreted to extend to vaccinations without updating the agreement?
I think that's a good question. And it's something that I've been reflecting on. A contractual requirement to be subjected to an independent medical examination, I wouldn't interpret as a contractual right to have an employee be vaccinated. But what I think it does do is that if you can establish that it's reasonable to make inquiries of employees whether or not they're vaccinated, and if they're not vaccinated, why not?
Yeah.
If an employee asserts that they are not vaccinated for a medical reason, I think you could then use that clause to say, well, we would like you independently examined to determine the nature of that medical reason. So it's a good thing to know if you've got that right, because I think what we've been seeing is that for those who don't want to be vaccinated, they're trying to rely, and also those who don't want to wear a mask, they're trying to rely on a medical reason, and sometimes those medical reasons are frankly pretty flimsy. Like, for example, masks, having a psychological issue with them, like a claustrophobia. So having that right to get someone independently examined rather than just having to rely on a certificate from a general practitioner is a good thing to have. When you get into the nitty-gritty of having a cohort of your workforce which is resistant to vaccination, or even discussions around it. And as I say, some employers don't have a choice but to engage in that back and forth because it's a health and safety risk.
Yes.
If you've got people potentially with the virus transmitting it to others at your work site. So it might sound like an unedifying back and forth to have to get into, but you've got to maintain a safe workplace. So it's a good question in that regard.
Thanks, Nick. We've got a couple of other questions, but I'll just let you talk for a little bit longer on your slides.
Thanks, Brenda.
Thank you.
I'll leave that the extent of that back and forth with you. So, lawful and reasonable directions. If your works site isn't subject to a compulsory health order and you don't have a contractual right, can you make a lawful and reasonable direction? Now, the notion of when a lawful and reasonable direction is a well-established principle in workplace relations. And really, what it comes down to is the context. And it's got to tick both of those boxes. It's got to be lawful. So obviously you can't direct an employee to do something which is unlawful. A direction to get vaccinated in that regard is lawful, because you're not asking them to do something which is unlawful. So the real question that it then comes down to is it reasonable? Now that's going to come down to the work site and inherently the health and safety risks. So if we could please go on to the next slide. So to assist in determining whether a direction to be vaccinated, or otherwise, I would again say more broadly how you look at the interaction between vaccination and your work site. and also, in fact, the risks more generally at your worksite, that the Fair Work Ombudsman has delineated 4 different tiers of worksites and the inherent risk in those tiers in relation to the virus. So the first risk, and what they call tier 1, which appear to be the most acute risk, is where employees are required to interact with others who are at an increased risk of being infected with the virus. And the historical example there has been border control or hotel quarantine. So you can anticipate that infected people you're going to come into contact with. And quite early on in the pandemic, that there's been mandatory requirements in relation to border control or hotel quarantine security staff being vaccinated. Now, I'd also raise the point here, though, that the interaction of staff at an increased risk of being infected, is hotel quarantine the most increased risk now that we have in Australia? Because if you look in the daily numbers, say coming out of New South Wales, the number of infections in the community are in fact far higher than the numbers of infections coming out of hotel quarantine. So I raised that as a point. Now, tier 2 work. So that's work that requires employees to have close contact with others who are particularly vulnerable to the virus. Now, the obvious example there is aged care workers, where you're dealing with senior members of our society who it's shown are at a far increased risk of morbidity as a result of the virus. So if you're coming into contact in your employment with people who are particularly vulnerable, older Australians or other individuals who are immunocompromised, that means that you're at one of the higher tiers as well, for tier 2. Now, tier 3, which I suspect a lot of the attendees at our webinar will be in, is where employees interact with or are likely to interact with other employees and others. So in other words, it's work that can't be done from home, work where human interaction is normally necessary and a part of it. So as I say, it's a lot of attendees are probably within that. And if you can't work from home, you're probably within that tier. And that's sort of confirmed then in the tier 4 work, where there's the lowest risk, is where employees have minimal face-to-face interaction. So they're the sort of tiers. So it's good to have a bit of a think about where your organisation sits within those tiers.
I think this just leads on to a really good question, actually.
Sure.
One of our attendees is asking, in terms of the reasonableness of the request and the nature of the workplace, do you think manufacturing employees could be included within the range of businesses discussed?
I think so. I mean, manufacturing employees, I would have thought would fit into tier 3. But also what is important is that those sorts of organisations have a bit of a think about anyone who's particularly vulnerable. For example, if they have a cohort of older workers, or if they have workers who are immunocompromised. And if we go back to that question about collecting health records, if you look at the risks there, the right to collect a health record might be not only in relation to whether or not someone's vaccinated, but if otherwise they're at high risk of infection, if they are infected. So that's how I would see manufacturing. I certainly wouldn't, manufacturing is not something that can be done from home. There might be some workers who work for an organisation that manufactures that can work from home, but really the work product is something that needs to be generated in the course of human interaction.
Right. And then just another person has asked actually, what tier would food processing workers and delivery drivers fall under?
Again, so I think at least tier 3,
Yeah.
but possibly tier 2 or 1. And I'll just give you an example that came up yesterday. We do a lot of work for the Fair Work Ombudsman, and they've got this referral service at the moment, which means that we're advising all sorts of different employees and employers about issues such as vaccination. And one of the things that was put to me yesterday is a food processing worker who in their delivery is required to go to regions of New South Wales that have the highest incidence of community transmission of the virus. So you might say there that if you've got a food processing worker who's necessarily required to go where there's particular regions where there's particularly high community transmission, that could even be a tier 1 in relation to those sorts of workers. And again, I'll make the point, just look at the amount of daily infection numbers coming out of some of those regions compared to the numbers in hotel quarantine. They're actually far higher. So I think you've got a food processing, you'd start with tier 3, and then you'd look at the context and then take it from there.
Okay. And sorry, just one more question. If an employer does not mandate the vaccination and the employee does not want to be vaccinated, but the government restrictions prevent them from doing their work, where does the employee stand in that case?
Well, they've got the health orders have got to be followed.
Yeah.
So if the employee doesn't want to be vaccinated, and the employer doesn't want to take the issue into their own hands in terms of saying, well, I'm going to make this direction, that they've still got to follow the health order. So it's taken out of both of their hands. Yeah. I think.
Okay, great.
If we can get the next slide. So in terms of then what the guidance note says, first of all, it encourages a collaborative approach. So, it's not just a question in the Fair Work Ombudsman's eyes of just laying down the direction without any pretext. That there is supposed to be this process of working together. So, for example, that the suggestion of the anonymous survey, that would be a good step in part of that. And the reality is that there's informal discussions going on all through different work sites in relation to just beginning to check the profile of vaccination within the work site. So in relation to tier 1 and tier 2 sites, what's specified is that the direction is more likely to be reasonable to be vaccinated, given the increased risk of being infected or giving coronavirus to someone who's particularly vulnerable. So if you're at a tier 1 or tier 2 site, it's more likely the direction is going to be reasonable. Now, tier 4 site, it's said that the direction is less likely or unlikely to be reasonable because it's not as relevant to the health and safety considerations of that work. Now, the tier 3 is where it gets a little bit interesting. And what's said there is that where there's no community transmission, the direction is less likely to be reasonable. But where there is community transmission occurring in an area, and the employer is operating in a workplace in that area that needs to remain open, i.e. it's not shut down or its workers aren't working from home, a direction to employees to receive a vaccination is more likely to be reasonable. Now, for those of you in metropolitan Victoria and those in metropolitan New South Wales, that is where we are at. We have community transmission, and that situation is unlikely to change. The pathway out of the current restrictions isn't a return to COVID elimination, it's vaccination. So that really does, that factual element of there being community transmission really changes the goalposts under the guidance note in relation to the capacity, I think, for employers to begin to regularise their approach to vaccination and employee approach. As I say, not just in relation to directing employees to get vaccinated, but all other issues as well, including, for example, asking them questions about it and requiring them to produce health records in relation to those questions. If we could get the next slide, Brenda, might be a good juncture for any questions.
Yes, apology, Nick. I was just pulling a few more up. Do you think there should be medical or religious exemptions when directing Tier 3 employees to be vaccinated, taking the discrimination grounds into consideration?
Well, you've got to, it's a good question, and you have to take the discrimination grounds into consideration. Now, so if I could just say a word about that, the equal opportunity legislation spells out certain protected attributes, and those attributes need to be reasonably accommodated in employment. So, for example, if you have a worker who can't be vaccinated for medical reasons, for example, they're pregnant, or if they have a particular blood clotting condition such that their medical advice is not to be vaccinated, then you've got an obligation to reasonably accommodate that condition. Now, reasonably accommodating that condition might mean, for example, is making adjustments for that particular employee. For example, maybe alternative duties working from home. Now, you can't get to that point until you have all of the information, which is why things like questions about the medical condition and its extent can become reasonably required. For example, in relation to pregnancy, it is a temporary condition, so that would only therefore mean that the requirement is in place for a limited period. In relation to medical reasons why someone can't be vaccinated, well, there's a little bit of flux in that as well. I mean, the updated medical advice, for example, in relation to AstraZeneca, is that it's not just any form of blood clotting. It's really rare and specific types of blood clotting issues, for example, abdominal, that are the only ones that make AstraZeneca not advisable. And now, of course, we've got other vaccines anyway. So I think if you're going to accommodate a protected attribute, you need to know what it is. Now, the other point I would make, and this would apply in relation to religious grounds and political beliefs, is the mere assertion of that right doesn't make it a protected attribute, in my view. That there's a capacity, I think, for an employer to actually drill down on that. For example, to take a medical one, is a concern about the risk of getting vaccinated generally, is that a medical reason? I would have thought probably not. If it is a religious reason, what is the real nature of that alleged religious reason? I think you can have a look at that. And in relation to it being a political belief, well, I'm probably a bit more of a believer that this is not a political issue.
Yep.
Now, if there is a political body who wants to take ownership of being unvaccinated, then good luck to them. But if someone's going to posit those sorts of reasons, then I think you're entitled to look at it. Plus, I think the other thing that you're entitled to say is, well, and there's a principle in anti-discrimination legislation called the inherent requirements of the position, and that means that even if you have the protected attribute, if you can't do the job, you can't do the job.
Yeah.
So here, the question is, well, okay, if you have that alleged religious or political belief, or the risk of vaccination is unacceptable to you as an individual, you have that right, but we don't think that we can keep you safe.
Yes.
In this workplace. And also, we don't think we can keep others safe if you're in the workplace. Now that's not a judgment. That's not rendering judgment on that reason. It's just it's a health and safety reality, and that's why I think the debate for employers, even if they're disinclined to get into it and front run it like other employers have, is you don't have a choice. You can't but you have a responsibility to keep your workers safe, and that includes, to the extent that you can, avoiding community transmission. Now, and that pathway now is vaccination.
Yeah, and it's obviously not just the workplace. It's also going to make it a lot more difficult for us to move around the country or to leave the country if we're not vaccinated. So it affects your day-to-day life as well.
Absolutely. And look, I did a school-specific webinar last Friday, and we spoke about the health and welfare of children in Victoria having so much time away from school. Now, the pathway out of that is vaccination. So, there's community considerations as well. So we'll speak a little bit more about that.
And I'm sorry, Nick, can I just, on that particular one, we've just had a question regarding someone who runs a school camp, and they deal with a lot of school students, obviously, who are largely unvaccinated, and they're saying the government has mandated all school staff to be vaccinated. Would it be reasonable for them to make the same stance? I think
it would. I think, and this is the thing about the virus, it's not selective as to who's an employee or who's a school or who's a camp. If there are people gathering, then there's the risk of transmission. Now, one thing that schools have got to contend with, and so too the camps, is that nowhere in the world at the moment can someone under 12, is it lawful for someone under 12 to be vaccinated? So, but we've seen with the Delta variant that children of that age are increasingly getting infected. So, and can pass on the infection to others who are more vulnerable of the more acute health risks. So these are all things that camps have got to consider. And I think, and that's why I say that there's health orders other than mandating vaccination that employees are entitled to take into account. And I think it would be perfectly reasonable for someone who operates school camps to adopt and take into account that vaccinations are now mandatory for schools. That just makes sense. So it might not be under health order, but it's based on the strong influence of the health order, which makes it lawful and reasonable.
Yeah, we've still got a few more questions, but I know that we are sort of at the 3/4 mark.
Yeah.
There was one that I did miss earlier on, Nick, and I'm sorry.
That's right.
In terms of the federal High Court ruling, has this topic been covered off already with that High Court ruling?
Yeah, I think I felt I covered that off in relation to the court challenges of health orders. It's a bit of a watch this space issue.
Yeah.
Until there is a successful challenge, employers have got to follow the orders, and I think are well protected in following the orders, notwithstanding any challenge to those orders.
Yep. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks. So the next point I just wanted to make is we've gone through the tiered approach, which I've mentioned, I think creates really good cover for employers. But I'd also make the point that employers aren't necessarily strictly adhering to the guidance note in relation to mandating vaccinations. And two recent examples, and there's been more recent examples since that I make, is SPC were very early to mandate vaccinations. Now, they've likened themselves to essential services and aged care, but they're a food processing site. So you might say the starting position for them is tier 3. I think at the time they made the mandating of vaccines, I'm not sure there was much community transmission where that site is located. So you don't feel that if you deem the risk to be such that you want to mandate vaccinations, that it starts and ends with the tier system in the Ombudsman guidance note. There are other legitimate considerations, and as I say, it's just a guidance note. Likewise, Qantas, the fact that their employees fly into multiple cities and come into contact with thousands of people, well, they're things which aren't specifically recognised in the tier system, but they may well still be relevant considerations. So I think the guidance note's really good cover, but if you want to do something, don't feel that you have to slavishly follow it. We'll get the next slide, thanks. So I touched upon this before, and I think I just only need to touch on it again because it's been dealt with through questions. That if you look at the guidance note, I've mentioned the position in relation to community transmission and how that's influenced in Victoria and New South Wales in particular. The other thing is just worth mentioning are the features of the Delta variant. The fact that the dominant, if not exclusive variant in operation in Australia. The fact that it would appear that it can be transmissible via very limited contact, people passing each other in the supermarket. It would appear to be transmissible in an outdoor setting more so, how that impacts construction sites, things like that. It would appear that it's got a greater transmissibility of younger people, including transmission of children. And it also does appear that even younger people are getting sicker. So we're talking now about a pandemic of the unvaccinated. When you're looking at the inherent risks associated with COVID, I think you're entitled to update your approach in light of the health information around the Delta variant. If I could get the next slide. I think we've largely covered those, so given time, I'll just gloss over this and we'll go to the employer action plan. Yep, so I'll take the next one, given time. So what does all of this mean? So as I've said, I don't think it's necessarily just a pure binary choice between mandating or not vaccinating your work site. That there's a host of considerations that I think employers should work through. Now not employers have huge resources at their disposal. It's not viable for employers to invest hundreds of thousands and days and weeks of their time doing this, but there's simple things I think that can be done and that I've certainly been assisting small employers to do in relation to managing this health and safety risk. And I think the other thing is just having a look at the specifics of your work site. What tier does it sit in? What workers are at risk of infection? The other thing is in cataloguing it, I think it's really important to have a foundational policy now that you've got at your work site that just recognises the occupational health and safety significance of vaccination and risk of infection with the virus. Now, that doesn't have to be complicated. I've settled for employers documents that just do that by way of a letter to all of their employees. But we need to spell it out, how it's relevant and why it's relevant. And then any features of that work site that create particular risks around type of work, type of workers, or other people who might be on site. So you can't just finish it employees, who else is going to be present where your employees are. Now, after you've spelt all of that out, looked at it and spelt it out in a simple form policy, think the first question really to ask is, well, do I have the right to ask the question? Now, whilst you've got to contextualise it, I think the threshold for asking the question is less than, say, the threshold for mandating it. So should you create a vaccine register? Now, one of the points I would make is that absent a register, a lot of employers, even anecdotally or informally, can get a bit of a sense of what proportion of their worksite is vaccinated. So, and that's helpful, but does that kind of informal approach go far enough? Now, it might not, because all it really takes is one. And so you might have a good sense that the overwhelming majority of your work site is vaccinated, but you might then have visitors on site that your workers are dealing with who are particularly vulnerable. And it would only take one worker to then create that risk. So sometimes I do think there can be good cause to say that a vaccine register ought to be established. Now that, and then there's sub-elements to that. Are you vaccinated? If you're not vaccinated, are you one dose? When are you scheduled to have your second dose? And if you're not vaccinated, why aren't you vaccinated? So I would think about how you establish that register and the extent of information that you get. And likewise, do you require people to provide proof of vaccination? Now, again, we're in a scenario where people might need to provide proof of vaccination even to go to the pub. So if it's being requested in that setting, would it be unreasonable for an employer to request it as well? The other point that I would make is otherwise supporting vaccination. For example, in schools, there's ways in which schools are able to expedite teachers getting vaccinated and also students getting vaccinated. So, and they can be informal as well. I've gotten anecdotal information from friends about what general practice clinics tend to have good availability and small waiting lists for vaccination. There's arrangements that can be struck with local health providers. Otherwise, there's other things you can do to encourage vaccination. Give them the paid leave, give them vouchers, encourage it generally. If you're in construction and you're going to be able to work with more productivity if you've got a certain proportion of your workforce vaccinated, spell it out to your workers. Look, we're not at optimum capacity. We're commercially challenged. We want to keep everyone on, but we've got to hit these things. So another thing is supporting and encouraging it and creating a culture where the connection between the workplace, people being safe, the viability of the workplace is all being brought together. And we're in a situation where people in Victoria are desperate to get some freedoms back, and workplaces are a part of that. If we could get the next slide. So just moving on from that, it's then looking at the overall rates of vaccination, because that then will inform, I think, whether or not you need to mandate vaccinations. Have you got a small cohort of workers that are unvaccinated that is manageable? And you can move things around. So you can stop short of it if you're disinclined to mandate vaccination. The other thing is, I think, anticipating reasons for remaining unvaccinated, then the utilisation of the required right to get an independent medical examination and rebuttals if the information or the justification for being unvaccinated doesn't bear scrutiny. And then creating control measures for unvaccinated staff and other on-site attendees. And that might be, taking off staff for some duties, requirements to wear masks, having, demarcating work sites for unvaccinated workers and things like that. So
Nick,
that's
it's Cooler here. Sorry to interrupt. We're getting an influx of questions. So I'm just wondering, would you like to do some more questions now, or would you prefer to wait till the end?
I think let's shoot to the end. If I could just maybe get the slide with my contact details up, and then what I do, I'm happy to dedicate the rest of the time to questions, and I'm happy to go over. I'm happy to start a question and answer now. But can I just say to everyone, if your questions are unanswered and you'd like to speak further, please do give me a call. There's my mobile number and my email. So happy to pick up the conversation afterwards if your specific questions are not answered, but happy to go with questions now.
Thanks, Nick. I'll start with one. If the employer mandates vaccination, are they now also liable for any adverse reactions to the employee?
So there is an indemnity that the federal government have offered in relation to adverse reactions to the virus and the connection between that and employer directions. So you need specific advice on the nature and scope of that indemnity, but I think you do have that level of comfort.
Thank you. Another question. In New South Wales, there is legislation being tabled that would make employers liable for any injuries or adverse effects caused by the vaccine, if it was mandatory for them to return to work.
I'm not familiar with that legislation. It strikes me as cutting across the federal indemnity. I think it's certainly something that you would want to watch this space on. So for New South Wales employers, it's something to look at. But I think that there is protections that can be put in place in relation to that. And you've got to look at that. You've got to look at that risk in the context of other risks. And, you know, if you take a position that you're not going to mandate vaccinations because there's a risk if one of your employers has an adverse response to that vaccination, what is the risk, conversely, of just allowing unvaccinated workers to continue to work in tier 1 or tier 2 sites? I'd say that that's the greater risk. Plus, there's ways in which that risk could be mitigated. For example, indicating that vaccinations are to occur in conjunction with medical advice from your practitioners, which is the approach that states have taken in relation to AstraZeneca.
Thank you, Nick. Somebody's just asked for your contact details, so I'll just pop them up again while we continue to answer a few more questions. Just one sec, please. You mentioned that it would be reasonable for Metro Sydney staff under Tier 3 to be asked to be vaccinated. Does this include Greater Sydney area who are currently under the same restrictions?
I think what you would do is you would look at the local government area. My understanding of the outbreak in Sydney is that different local government areas really do have different profiles in relation to the amount of virus in the community. So I would be looking at that, but I'd also be looking at how that workforce interacts with those local government areas where there's a lot of virus. You know, you might be just outside it, but you might be required to interact with or go into those local government areas all the time. So I think you would look at that overall context. But if you look at the numbers in New South Wales, the numbers in Victoria, and where they expect the numbers to go in Victoria, I think any Tier 3 worksite in a metropolitan setting is entitled to have, you know, a close look at mandatory vaccinations. But if it's not inclined to do so, then all of the previous control measures I've just mentioned, creating registers, encouragement, and things like that.
Great, thank you. Are you seeing many clients moving towards having compulsory vaccination policies directing employees to have the vaccination by a certain date?
If the position is that it's mandatory vaccination, then the tendency is to make that date specific. In terms of what I'm seeing from clients, I'm seeing a lot of clients go in other directions. So not mandating it, but stress testing their organisation against it, and then drilling down on what cohort is unvaccinated and taking it from there. But the other point I'd make is it's incredibly fluid. For example, we just don't, and it's fluid also on the basis of what is going to open up when. You know, for example, cafe workers or pubs. Well, they're not open now. Their workers are stood down or working from home. There's no need now, but when everything opens back up, then you would anticipate there's going to be a need then. Now, if we've got a health order saying that anyone who goes to that kind of facility needs to be vaccinated and shows a passport, then you can anticipate you're in a context where it's very reasonable for employers to require the same of their employees if they're not already subject to a health order. So that's kind of what I'm seeing at the moment. But one thing I will say is that unless you're in professional services where you can work from home, or my clients are looking at it in some way or another.
Thank you, Nick. If someone doesn't want to get vaccinated, do you need to disclose to them that you feel that you can't keep them safe in the workplace?
I think the answer to that, well, if you don't feel you can keep them safe, then yes. And what I mean by that is that if you're going to issue a direction, or if you're going to dismiss someone for failing to obey a lawful and reasonable direction, you've got to contextualise that. Now, the context that I'm advocating for in relation to vaccinations is a health and safety context. So you can't. I think if push comes to shove in that discussion, then I think that's what you've got to spell out to them and be able to justify as well.
Nick, we've still got about 11 questions left, and I realise that we are over time at this point. A lot of these questions are from anonymous attendees, so I would encourage those people to, of course, reach out to Nick if they do want to get more questions answered, simply because we have run out of time. We've also unfortunately lost Brenda in the meantime. She's had a few technical difficulties. I
am back.
Oh, fantastic. Hello, Brenda.
Hello. I'm not sure what happened, but my screen froze and I had to restart, so I apologise.
No problem. I was just wrapping up in relation to the Q&A. We do still have 11 unanswered questions. So really up to you guys if you'd like to continue or if we'd like to try to reach out to the people that have asked those questions. Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think there are so many great questions today, and Nick has obviously tried to answer them as best as he could with the information that he has. But yeah, certainly I'd encourage you to contact Nick or to contact us at HR Anywhere as well, and let's talk through those, because there's a lot of detail behind a lot of those questions that we're just not aware of, and we want to make sure that we provide you with an informed advice. So I think, look, Nick, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a really topical issue. We still have a lot of participants on the line that are still interested in hearing lots of information. Unfortunately, we are out of time. And obviously you can contact Nick, as we said. There's the details for HR Anywhere. We've got the 1300 number or the advice email line as well. We thank you all so much for taking this 1 hour out of your busy days, and thank you very much, and we look forward to presenting you with some more webinars in the future. So please do also let us know if there's any particular topics you'd like us to talk about, and that way we can present something that's really interesting and topical for the audience. Thank you.
Thanks everyone, and stay safe.